Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, where we'll be looking at the difference between employees and independent contractors and how to determine which one makes most sense for your business. We appreciate you all joining us, and I want to go over just a few things before we jump in. We will be recording the session, and we'll send out an email with a link to the video so you can have access to the material later. We also welcome your questions, so please type any general questions you have in at any time on the right-hand side of your GoToWebinar panel, and we'll make sure we leave time at the end to get to those. If your questions are very specific to your situation, we encourage you to make an appointment with Courtney or any of our other SBDC consultants to dive into those specifics. I will put a link to the scheduling page on our website here in the chat in a bit. So I'm Hannah Curtis. I'm a coordinator with the North Metro SBDC, and I'm so happy to introduce to you today our presenter, Courtney Berg. Courtney is a SBDC HR Consultant and founder of CourtSide Consulting, and we feel so fortunate to have Courtney's expertise today. So Courtney, I will turn it over to you.
Well, Hannah, thank you so much. It's a privilege to be here. Thanks to the North Metro SBDC for inviting me to come talk about this important topic. And thanks to all of you for joining me on independent contractor versus employee. How do you know which is best for your business? Worker and employee classifications are two issues that cause a lot of trouble for business owners. It can be a point of contention with the workers. It can also create administrative issues for the business. And certainly it can be very costly if you get it wrong. So today I'm going to walk you through information that will help you as you look at your current staff or as you plan to hire your next worker. Now, before I do that, let me tell you just a little bit about myself. As Hannah said, my name is Courtney Berg, and I'm certified in human resources. I have a background in human resources and operations management, and I opened my consulting practice, CourtSide Consulting, 13 years ago, really because I have a passion for working with managers on employee performance success. Now, a lot of people call that performance management, but performance management has such a negative connotation. So I work with performance success, and that helps lead the companies to higher profits throughout the organization. And performance success starts with your handbook. It's dealing with communicating those expectations and holding employees accountable. So that's what I help my clients with every day. Now, if you have questions, as Hannah said, as I'm going through the information, please put them in the chat and we'll have time for them at the end of the presentation today. So let's get started. So what are we going to cover? Well, I thought I'd start with some basic definitions and then dive into keys to knowing if you should have an employee or an independent contractor relationship with your particular worker. Now, we will talk about the work being done, and we're also going to visit 3 areas that are of great importance when categorizing your workers. So I also want to cover, kind of as a bonus, if you will, employee classification. So once you decide someone's an employee, are they an hourly or a salaried employee? Because many business owners misclassify employees, and that can lead to huge fines as well. So we'll be talking about the issues with misclassifying workers, and then we'll have some time for Q&A. So let's move on to some of those definitions. When it comes to determining the type of worker that you want to hire, we need to go through a couple of these definitions to ensure we're all on the same page. So let's start with the term worker. I use the term worker to represent someone before you have made the decision to hire them either as an independent contractor or an employee. So you know you need a worker to do some type of job or some type of work for you. And after that decision is made, after you say, yes, I need that worker, then you need to determine if that worker is an independent contractor or an employee. So when you hear the word worker, that's what I'm talking about. So what about employees and independent contractors? What am I talking about there? Well, an employee is someone who you hire to do work for you. You control their actions, what they do and how they do it. They have probably a regular work schedule that you control, so you control when they do it. You give them a wage, an hourly wage, a weekly wage that you pay them on a regular basis. They perform the work that you tell them to, when you tell them to do it, and how you tell them to do it. You bring them on, they complete a W-4, you give them a W-2 at the end of the year. Um, you pay employer taxes on that individual, and perhaps you provide benefits to them, maybe a non-disclosure agreement or some kind of conflict of interest form, something like that. So that's an employee. Now, what about an independent contractor? An independent contractor is really a different story. You can control or direct only the result of the work, but not what that work will be or how that work will be done, um, or how they do it, really. If you don't like that relationship, you can end the contract. At least that should be in the contract you have with an independent contractor, something about how they're doing the work or the work that you expect, your expectations regarding that work. But the problem is that they could actually sit and play on their phone all day long and not do a thing, and then work all night to get it done. And as long as they get that result, that's all good. All you're worried about is a result of an independent contractor, not when or how they do it, but that they get you the results that you've asked for. You complete a W-9, or they complete a W-9 and give that to you, and then you give them a 1099 at the end of the year. You do not pay taxes on the money that you pay them. It is their responsibility to pay those taxes. They're typically self-employed and have a company name. And again, they're hired for results and not for a specific job. They're free to act how they want. You have very limited control on what you can do, and that's spelled out in the contract you have with them. So how do you decide? Now that we understand the differences between the independent contractor and employee, let's talk about how to decide if the worker that you're thinking of right now is an independent contractor or an employee. So let's start with the work being done. You should think about the work that needs to be done when determining if you need an independent contractor or an employee. So for example, some people hire independent contractors for bursts of work that comes their way. For example, a florist on Valentine's Day may hire someone to deliver flowers for just one day, just to get all those flowers out for Valentine's Day. Or a manufacturing company may hire independent contractors to handle a specific overload of business for a period of time. Or an event planner may hire independent contractor servers for a wedding. The key is that it's a short duration for a specific event or a specific purpose. That's the key for independent contractors. Now, an opposite consideration is if you need someone who is going to be doing work related to your core business on a regular basis for a long term. If that's true, then classifying them as an employee may be more appropriate. The other things you can think about are, do you have to train them to do the job, or do they already know how to do it, right? Um, what about the sequence of work? Do you require the work to be done in a specific order or sequence? Are you wanting to control their actions? So if you have to train them and you require a certain specific order or sequence of work, and you're going to want to control their actions, and then all of those things leans toward an employer-employee relationship rather than an independent contractor. So that's why you want to think about the work being done. And think about those things that are up on the screen: duration and schedule related to your core business, training, and then the control over work. Now let's talk about 3 areas of importance. The IRS has some tests that will help you classify workers. They used to have, I think it was 22 questions that you could answer that would guide you into this determination if somebody was an employee or an independent contractor. They have simplified that, or at least they've said that they've simplified it, and put most of those 22 questions into 3 core areas: control, business aspects, which deals with finances really, and contracts and benefits. So I want to spend some time here with these 3 areas as they are significant in determination of the workers' classification. Now, I'm going to cover highlights today in these 3 areas and on other things that we're going to discuss. But I think this is a good time to say that I'm not an attorney and I'm not giving any legal advice. What I am covering here is not meant to be all inclusive. It's not This is not a black or white thing. There's a lot of gray as we discuss the differences between employees and independent contractors. So when making this decision, you need to do your homework. You need to talk to an attorney or an HR consultant to ensure that you're doing it right. As I said before, it is very, very costly to get this wrong. So take your time with these decisions and make sure that you're doing it correctly. So let's talk about those three key areas. The first one being behavioral control. So I've listed some items here that we're going to run through quickly regarding behavioral control. For example, instructions. Employees are more often required to comply with employer instructions on the specifics like when, where, how they are to perform their duties. Independent contractors really are not following specific instructions by the person that hires them. Training is the same way. Training shows control over the means as how that work is done, and that indicates employee status. The hiring or supervising or even paying of assistants, if you hire the worker's staff or control the worker's staff in some way, that indicates more control and therefore indicates an employee status. Set work hours indicates that that's probably more of an employee status than an independent contractor status. Doing work on your premises. A lot of times if you set up an office, and I know right now with the pandemic, we have a lot of remote work going on, but in the time when you do have that office set up and you have a physical office and you ask your independent contractors to come on site and they have their own office and you provide all their equipment, that lends itself more towards an employee relationship than an employer relationship. And then obviously the order of work being done, we've talked about that. If that sequence or order is important, then that is another control factor. So that's something else that the IRS or Department of Labor will look at. And then reports. Requiring regular reports may indicate employer control, thus more of an employee status. So if you're requiring weekly reports on what they're doing and how far they're getting, the more often that those reports are required, the more that you dictate how those reports should look, that again indicates more control and thus leans itself more towards employee status. So what I did was I tried to make a little graph here that we could just look at. If you're controlling their performance, you're telling them how to do something, you're telling them what they need to do specifically, and you're controlling that performance, then if you're doing that, then that's probably more of an employee than an independent contractor. If the person that you're hiring, that worker that you're hiring, is controlling how they do things and what exactly they're doing to get the result that you want, then that's more of an independent contractor. It falls more under that. Setting the schedule, the same thing. If you're controlling it, it's more of an employee. If the independent contractor is controlling it, then that worker if the worker is controlling it, then that's more of an independent contractor relationship. Selecting projects. If you're selecting the projects that the employee is doing, then that's more of an employee relationship. If the worker is selecting the projects that he or she wants to do, then that's more of an independent contractor. And whether or not they work for others, what I'm really looking at here is not necessarily, oh, we've got somebody that works for us, but then also has a part-time job. But somebody more that is more often working for a variety of jobs rather than just working for two, or in this case, sometimes we're seeing workers work 3 jobs. But what we're looking for here is if the employee is dedicated to your employer relationship versus somebody who does work for you occasionally, but you're not dictating anything else, and they also have other clients. So that's what that means. Now let's talk about financial control. So independent contractors are usually a party to a contract, and we're going to talk about that next, but they're usually paid by the job, or maybe you're hiring them to do some marketing efforts, so you might give them a percentage of the money that's made, something like that, but they have a specific result that they're being paid for, versus an employee typically gets a hourly or a salaried payment on a regular basis. So how you're paying them and that financial control over how you're paying them indicates whether or not they're an employee or independent contractor. Whether or not you're paying their expenses. Independent contractors should be covering their expenses. They should cover all those costs. But if you're reimbursing them for certain expenses, then that may be more indicative of an employee relationship. Same thing with tools and materials. Independent contractors generally provide their own tools, materials, equipment, those types of things. If you're providing them with the tools and materials and equipment to do the job, then that may indicate more of an employee-employer relationship. And worker investment, when we're talking about worker investment, it's really investment in the business or the facilities or the supplies. Typically an employee doesn't do that. Like they don't help rent the office space. You're renting the office space. Maybe you're paying for all the software, those kinds of things. You're making that investment in those tools for the worker to use, versus an independent contractor would have a significant investment in their equipment or in their office space or those types of things. So the significant investment side, if somebody is doing that and they're a worker for you, they probably would be more classified as an independent contractor than an employee. And as you can see, I've gone through these last, the last couple of slides. There's gray area, right? Because you could have somebody who you're paying on a regular basis, but you don't control them at all. You don't provide them any tools. You don't reimburse them for their expenses. They have their own business. They're doing all those things. So while you're paying them regularly, everything else falls into the side of independent contractor. And that's that's what we have to look at. We have to look at what really is indicating more of an independent contractor relationship than an employee relationship when we're looking at all of these things. So here's another graph another chart that I put together. Hourly or salaried payment on a regular basis, if that's happening, that's more of an employee than an independent contractor. Expense reimbursement, again, that's more of an employee. If they pay for tools and materials, that's more of an independent contractor, just as investing in business is more of an independent contractor. So the third thing that I wanted to cover was the type of relationship. So if the integration is the first thing that's listed here that the IRS and departments of labor look at, if the worker's duties are strongly tied to the success of the business. In that case, workers are more likely to be subject to more control and thus are more likely an employee versus an independent contractor. So if if their work that they're doing is tied to your success on a very deep level, then that's probably more of an employee than an independent contractor. Continuing relationships, long-term relationships between workers and employers indicate an employee status more than an independent contractor. Full-time work required. If a worker is required to work full-time for a single employer, that indicates employee status versus independent contractor. Again, that's over a period of time. That's not just a short burst, but that's over a period of time. Shared profits and losses. So the ability to recognize profits and losses are generally not realized by employees. It's more indicative of an independent contractor status. If you're an independent contractor and you send out a proposal for a job and you realize that you were short on hours for that particular job, you didn't charge for enough hours. As an independent contractor, you eat that time. You don't charge for more. Whereas if you're an employee and you're working and a job takes longer than you thought it was, that it would take, and maybe you have to work some overtime, the employer is responsible for paying for that overtime. So that's the difference there. Multiple employers, again, if you're working for more than one employer, that's more of indicative of an independent contractor status. An independent contractor on that point can work for a competitor of yours, whereas an employee can't. Now, of course, you can have a contractual agreement with an independent contractor, but for the most part, they can advertise and pick up jobs that they want to work for, even if it is for your competitor. Independent contractors make their services available to the public, and so generally they're advertising for that. As I said, they're marketing themselves so that they can get more work. The right to discharge. The employer possesses the right to discharge a worker. That's more indicative of an employee status. With an independent contractor, there's typically contractual obligations that happen. So the employer can't just say, okay, yeah, you're out of here unless that independent contractor has not fulfilled the contractual obligations that they've agreed to. Same thing on the right to terminate. Workers, if they're employees, they can terminate their status without incurring any liability to the employer, but an independent contractor will, they actually have a contract that they have to follow. So they have to make sure that they're following that contract and not terminating it unfairly or without grounds that are specified in that contract. So again, just for the little table that I put together here, if you perform core business work regularly, that's more of an employee than an independent contractor. If full-time is required, that's more of an employee status than an independent contractor. Services available to the public, typically that's more of an independent contractor than an employee. And the right to terminate the relationship without any liability to the employer, if they have that right, then that's more of an employee of an independent contractor. I apologize, that slide is backwards. So the independent contractor does not have the right to terminate, and the employee does have the right to terminate without any liability to the employer. So let's talk recently on September 25th, the end of September, the Department of Labor came out with a proposed new rule. And what they're trying to do is make this even simpler, because the independent contractor versus the employee relationship is so difficult for business owners to figure out. It's just convoluted. It's, these 22 questions. Now we're down to 3 things. It's just really hard. How do I know what takes precedent? How do I know what is weighted more? And so the Department of Labor has come out with something now that is up for public comment. And what they've come out with is a proposed new rule that separates out core factors from other factors. And the core factors are given more weight in the determination if somebody is an employee versus an independent contractor. So the core factors that the Department of Labor is proposing now under their new rule is saying that the nature and degree of the individual's control over the work is something that is a core factor. So if you have no control or virtually no control over the work that you do, that's more of an employee. If you have a lot of control over that work, then that is more of an independent contractor relationship. Also, the individual's opportunity for profit and loss. Again, we get back to that proposal that someone wrote that didn't include enough time to get the work done, and so they were short on hours, right? That individual has an opportunity for a loss on that particular proposal or that particular job, whereas an employee would be paid overtime and be compensated for that extra time. So an individual's opportunity for profit or loss is more of an independent contractor. The higher that opportunity, the higher the likelihood is that they're an independent contractor versus an employee. Now, the other factors that are coming into play include the amount of skill required for the work, the degree of permanence of the working relationship between the individual and the employer, and then whether the work is part of an integrated unit of production. So in other words, if they're really core to that business and what's happening there. So this is currently up for you to make comments on, and so you can just Google the Department of Labor proposed new rules regarding regarding independent contractors or employees. And public comments are being accepted up until October 26th is the date that public comment is going to be shut off. So be sure and go in and take a look at that, learn a little bit more about it, and then feel free to make public comment based on what you're learning. So when you're talking about employee versus independent contractor, again, that's I want to hire a worker. I want to bring somebody on to do some work for me. And so do I want to hire an employee or an independent contractor? And I was doing a presentation about this many, many years ago, and one of my friends who is an attorney was helping me, and she started her portion of the presentation by saying this: everyone is born a non-exempt employee. What she meant by that was in order to classify someone as an independent contractor or an exempt salaried employee, you have to be able to prove that they aren't a non-exempt or hourly employee. Now, we just spent some time talking about independent contractors or employee, and you may have determined that the independent contractor is not the way to go for you, that you want that control and you want them to work for you and not your competitors, and you want to have them there full time, and you want to do the things that we've talked about, and so you've decided, okay, I'm going to hire them as an employee. Well, that's great. You can provide them the tools and the training. You can do all of those things that you can do for them as an employee that you cannot do as an independent contractor, right? So you can enjoy the at-will relationship with the worker, which means that you don't have to wait until they break a contract to let them go. You can actually make a determination that you're going to terminate them, um, for any reason, with or without notice, and letting them know that. Now, obviously, discrimination laws come into play with the at-will status, but that just means an at-will relationship means that you can terminate them for any reason, with or without notice, and they can leave for any reason, with or without notice. And so let's just assume that you decide to bring someone into your organization as an employee. There is yet another classification question that we need to answer, and that's, how do you pay them? So I'm going to switch gears and have some bonus content over this information because it's just as important. And believe it or not, as you're making your decision to hire the employee, many businesses think that they can decide if an employee is paid on an hourly or salary basis. And that's an understandable assumption. I mean, after all, you have control over them, you own your business. Shouldn't you be able to decide if you're paying them on an hourly or salaried basis? The quick answer for that is no, you can't. There are very specific restrictions on who you can pay a salary to. So let's talk about employee classification. So now we've decided, we've looked at independent contractor versus employee, and you've said, I want an employee. So now we're looking at an employee classifications. The first being non-exempt. I want you to think hourly employee. So overtime applies. Non-exempt means they are not exempt from overtime. That means they get overtime, all right? They're paid on an hourly basis. They must be paid at minimum wage level or higher per hour. They are eligible for overtime. And they can apply to any position, and they're covered. It can apply to any position. So you can pay anybody hourly, even your managers. You can pay anybody hourly that you want to. But that individual is covered under the Fair Labor Standards Act regulations. Okay. In Colorado, just to remind you of this, state and federal overtime rules apply. So in Colorado, if someone works over 40 hours in a week, that's federal guidelines, but it's also Colorado guidelines. If they work over 40 hours in a week, they get paid overtime, which is time and a half. But in Colorado, also if they work over 12 hours in a day, they get paid time and a half. So I used to work in the ambulance industry, and we would have 12-hour shifts. And we would have somebody that came in and worked 3 shifts, and maybe they worked 13-hour days in a week for a total of 39 hours. Well, since they worked 3 days of 13-hour shifts, they actually got paid 3 hours of overtime because they worked an extra hour in a day over that 12 hours. So you can have overtime even if somebody doesn't work over 40 in a week. So 12 in a day, anything over 12 in a day qualifies for overtime, and anything over 40 hours in a week qualifies for overtime. Important distinction there to make sure that you're paying your non-exempt or hourly employees correctly. Now let's talk about exempt employees. Exempt status means salary, okay? They are not eligible for overtime. And there are 3 tests for exempt employees. The duties test, so their job duties must qualify. And we're going to go over that just briefly in a minute. The salary basis test, that means that they're guaranteed a minimum amount of pay each week. And the salary level test, This just came into play January 1st of this year, but exempt employees must be paid at least $684 per week. That works out to $35,568 per year in order for them to be paid on a salary basis and be exempt from overtime. And that's that salary level test that they have to have. The duties test is a huge component of this classification, and there are several areas of exemption based on duties. So let me just review them briefly. An executive exemption is just managing others, making employment decisions, hiring and firing, that kind of thing, performance reviews, discipline, that type of stuff. A professional exemption is typically one of those supportive areas, human resources, finance, or accounting, those types of things. So they make some decisions independently, but they're also those general departments that support the business operations. Professional exemption falls into doctors and lawyers. There's even a creative professional for actors and singers and those kinds of things. Outside sales is one that small business looks at and says, well, I've got an outside salesperson, and so I'm going to pay them by a salary, or I'm going to pay them only by commission, those kinds of things. Outside sales exempt qualification is if they are not in an office, if they are out selling all the time. They may have an office that they come in the morning, they grab their stuff and they leave and they go out and they sell all day. And then you don't see them maybe the rest of the week, or you don't see them for a few days, and they come back and they drop some things off and they leave. So they're primarily outside the office selling. That's what outside sales is. It's not that person that's sitting at the desk and doing half day of calls and then going to a couple of places in the afternoon. This is somebody who is out all the time. The computer exemption is not somebody who works on the computer all the time, but is specific for programming, system analysts, software engineer, those types of people. So when you're thinking about employees that you want to pay salary to, you've got to make sure that they fall under one of those exemptions: executive, professional, the outside sales, the computer programming, those types of offices, those types of those types of exempt statuses that you can have. And then there is another category that you can have. You can have a non-exempt salaried employee, which is you're going to set a weekly salary with them, but they're still eligible for overtime. It's something that if you're going to do that, you need to talk to somebody about to make sure that you're following all the rules for that particular classification. Okay, so now we know classifying workers can be complicated and multifaceted. So what happens if you do it wrong, right? That crossing your fingers and hoping that you're doing it right can get you into trouble. So let's talk about what that looks like. What are the misclassification issues that you have that we need to dive into and work through? But if you have those misclassification issues, what are some of the things that happen to you as an employer if you misclassify somebody? So let's first look at independent contractor versus employee. I've got the picture, if you give a mouse a cookie, and if any of you are parents out there, I have a son that I read that book to a long time ago, but it's that if you give the mouse a cookie, then the mouse is going to want some milk, and if you give the mouse milk, then the mouse is going to want something else, and if you give the mouse that, then the mouse is going to want something else, and it's just this continuation of they want more if you give a mouse a cookie. And when you're looking at misclassified workers, it seems that things happen so that they just keep talking to you about the money that you now need to pay because you've misclassified a worker. So for example, if you misclassify a worker as an independent contractor instead of an employee, so you've made that determination, but you misclassify that person. The Department of Labor or the IRS could come back and say, well, not only is this person classified as an employee, but they're classified as a non-exempt employee, and they feel that they've worked overtime, And so you owe them overtime pay. Oh, and you owe taxes, your employer taxes on all of the money that you should have paid this person as an employee instead of an independent contractor. Oh, and you owe back unemployment as part of those employment, those employer taxes. And you also needed to provide workers' compensation for that employer. So you need to make sure that you've taken care of that aspect of it because they should be an employee, not an independent contractor. And then they're going to tack on fines and penalties. And they're going to be looking at, did you have awareness of that individual being an independent contractor versus an employee? And you went ahead and you said, yeah, maybe an employee, but I'm going to classify them as an independent contractor. And you can't really justify your decision as an independent contractor. That's just what you chose. And it could be, well, I just started my business and I didn't have a lot of money. Not an excuse for the IRS or departments of labor. They're still going to be looking at fines and penalties for you. So so that's really an important thing to be thinking about. The misclassification issues on exempt versus non-exempt is the same type of thing. If you've hired an employee but misclassified them as an exempt employee instead of a non-exempt one, then you've got overtime pay, taxes, unemployment, workers' comp that may apply. The unemployment and workers' comp may apply because those are based on payroll. So you're going to have to be looking at and then fines and penalties on top of that. And so there's a lot of things that come into play. And as I was saying, if you give a mouse a cookie, well, it gets even worse. Because if you misclassify a worker in Colorado, as well as several other states, but specifically in Colorado, Colorado has a letter of understanding between the Departments of Labor, the IRS, and the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, stating that if one of those regulatory agencies finds something, they will share that information with the others, leading to multiple audits and possible multiple fines. So if just wanting to do it right wasn't enough of incentive, the amount of money that the government could take if you do it wrong might be. So let me walk through an example real briefly here. If somebody says that you have unfair hiring practices because they were not hired, and let's say that they're an over 40 female and they say you didn't hire them because they were an over 40 female and you hired a younger male, for example. So they go and they say, I was discriminated against based on age, and I was discriminated against based on gender, on sex. The EEOC can look that over and can determine whether or not you've had any problems with discrimination or what the situation was in that particular case. They can look at your hiring practices, and as they start looking at things, they may say, you know what, in addition to that, they're hiring these people and they're not hiring them as non-exempt employees. They're hiring them as maybe independent contractors, or they're hiring them as exempt employees. And so then the EEOC can share that information with the departments of labor, which means that the state, Colorado, would come into play, but also the US Department of Labor and the IRS. And so that one, hey, I think they have unfair hiring practices, can lead to audits from the EEOC and an investigation into that claim, and then audits from the departments of labor. So both the US Department of Labor and the Colorado Department of Labor can come in, and the IRS can come in. So it can lead to a whole bunch of things. So that's why you want to make sure that you are classifying correctly. So getting back to my friend who's a lawyer who said everyone is born a non-exempt employee, that's just the simplest thing to say. Because if you're hiring somebody that is not a non-exempt employee, you have to prove that they're not. You have to prove that that worker is not a non-exempt or an hourly employee. You have to prove that a worker qualifies for independent contractor status and be able to say, no, I've gone through this checklist, or I've gone through these steps, and I determined that that individual is an independent contractor. And if you've hired somebody as an employee, but you've hired them as exempt, or you've put them on a salary and taken away their opportunity to have overtime paid to them, then you have to prove that the employee qualifies for that exempt status. So that's why my lawyer friend says everyone is born a non-exempt employee when you're thinking about hiring somebody, because you've got to be able to prove as the owner of the business why you hired them under a different capacity for your business. So, as I said, the the burden of the proof is on you, and you really need to be careful because misclassifications are very, very costly for business. And once one organization in Colorado, the Department of Labor or the IRS, figures out, hey, this person's misclassified, they're under an obligation to notify other entities in our government who can also come in and give you fines and penalties. So lots of information there. I left a lot of time for questions, so I want to be able to open it up for questions and just see if there's anything I can answer. I know I went through some of that information quickly, but I wanted to get to this side of the presentation so I could make sure that I'm answering the things that are important to you.
Great. Thank you, Courtney. This has been really helpful. A couple questions have come in so far, and everyone listening, feel free to keep putting those in. So someone asks if they do have an employee that they feel is misclassified, what would be the steps to classify them correctly?
Sure. So, and that happens. Sometimes you'll go through maybe just a review of your payroll and determine, ooh, you know what? I'm looking at job descriptions and I'm determining that this individual isn't classified properly, that they're an exempt employee, so I'm going to move them to a non-exempt employee. So what I would do, number one, if you have a business attorney, just run this by them, make sure that they're comfortable with it. But from an HR standpoint, you can go ahead and make a note as to why you need to reclassify that employee, and then do it as soon as possible. Do it at the start of the next pay period. And the thing that, from an HR standpoint, that I would remind you of is you want to be careful how you talk to your employees about this. And the reason that I say that is because if somebody's on a salary, for whatever reason, human nature says if you get moved to an hourly position after you've been on a salary, it feels like a demotion. It feels like, well, I used to be salary and now I'm hourly, and somehow that's bad. And I've seen that time and time again over my journey through this HR maze that I play in every day. So make sure that you're talking to your employees and explaining to them that you came to this presentation, for example, and you realized that you wanted to make sure that everybody was classified properly, and as you looked at it, that they belong into the non-exempt employee rather than an exempt. Now, the other question that comes up has to do with, okay, if they've been misclassified, have they been working overtime, and do you owe them any overtime? And in some situations you might. And so you want to take that under advisement, and you want to look at that and say, they've been working 45 hours a week for the last couple of months, and so maybe you want to give them that back pay. So again, what I would do is make sure that you talk to an attorney before you make any determinations like that. You want to have conversations with that attorney and specify, okay, these are the employees that I want to move to a non-exempt, this is why. The other option that you may have is making sure, and let me back up just for 1 second, and that is when you move them from salaried to non-exempt, or from exempt to non-exempt, so from salaried to hourly, make sure that you don't change their pay. Their pay should be the same. So they should get, X number of dollars per hour based on what their salary was. Not a new pay system that you're going to totally change their pay. This may be a situation when you do that, this may be a situation where you want to say, you know what, I'm going to do something like, I'm going to do a non-exempt salaried, so I'm going to pay them a certain amount of money each week. And if you pay every other week, that's fine. But per week, you're going to, I'm going to pay them $700 a week. And if they don't work the full 40 hours, they still get that $700. And if they work over 40 hours in a week or over 12 hours in a day, then they get overtime based on that, how that $700 works out to an hourly rate, because they get time and a half. So it might be something that you want to consider doing that non-exempt salary for.
Great, thank you. That's very helpful. Another question came in about people who are selling at consignment sales. They can earn a higher percentage at those sales if they volunteer. So how would they be categorized if you are an owner of those sales and you're giving a higher percentage to people who will volunteer to work for you, but then they are rewarded with that higher percentage? How would they be categorized as a volunteer or as an employee is the question.
Hmm. Well, that's a tough one. So I'm assuming, I guess what I'm picturing is like an art mart or something like that, where you have artists that bring their goods to be sold into a large, I know they have some around the area where they have different artists that display their artwork or their goods in one building. And then the artists come in at different times during the week, and they're the ones that are helping everyone. So, so I think that looking at that, the thing that you need to remember is if you're having volunteers there, then they're volunteers. If you're compensating people for being there and covering the floor and making the sales, then they may be classified as employees, and you want to make sure that if you're paying them commission, that you're paying them minimum wage. You're at least paying the minimum wage per hour, which is $12 per hour right now. So you want to take that into consideration as far as what they're doing, and that's true also of commissioned salespeople. So if you have commissioned salespeople, you want to make sure that they may be working 40 hours a week and they may just be getting commission, but you want to make sure they're getting at least 12 hours or $12 per hour or whatever the minimum wage is, depending on when you do this, because it's coming. Let's see, we're in Q4, and I know minimum wage is going to go up in January again. So right now it's $12 an hour.
Great, thank you. That's really helpful. And those are some really good considerations to keep in mind when thinking about all of this. So those are all of our questions for now. You've done such a great job presenting this all very clearly. And like I said, we will send out an email later today with this recording. So you'll have access to these answers and to this presentation. So thank you, Courtney, so much for your time and for helping us as we look at all of these issues. And we wish you all a great rest of your day. I will give one more plug for our consulting services. If you do have further questions, it's northmetrosbdc.com. We'd love to see you make some consultation appointments there. So thank you all for joining us, and we'll see you next time.